So it's Monday, and the reality of the global economy as of today is that America is no longer a superpower. It is a distressed asset. It is a house in a neighborhood that the rest of the world is essentially trying its damnedest to move out of. Welcome back, everybody. The last 72 hours, I've been watching this geopolitical circus that's been going on, especially in Washington, D.C. Now, before the weekend actually started, the Supreme Court ruled that the tariffs, the IEEPA tariffs of 2025 were illegal. Now, of course, we were right to point out that corporations all over the world essentially are going to be suing the U.S. government for up to $177 billion to get that money back. And that the citizens of the United States who actually carried the bill, carried those costs that were pushed down onto them through the grocery stores, Lowe's, Victoria's Secrets, they get nothing. So the Supreme Court looks at the executive branch and is like, listen, you can't just arbitrarily put a tax on the planet under the guise of national security. That's not something that you can do. And for a microsecond there, the global markets just kind of exhaled. Okay, maybe we're going to go back to some kind of normality, and maybe working with the United States isn't out of the question anymore. But no, lo and behold, the great president of the United States stopped posting on Truth Social for just a moment, got off of his golden commode, walked up to the press and said, they're disgraceful, they don't like the Constitution, they don't like the country. We're just going to put a blanket 15% tariff on all global imports coming into the United States. So this administration begins rummaging through the basement of bureaucracy to try to find the Section 122 of the Trade Act of 1974. And like I said, immediately slaps a 15% universal tariff on everything. It's the same thing, really. They just changed the font and re-uploaded it. And the rest of the world just threw their hands up and said, what the hell is this? Let's start with the Europeans, because the fallout for that one is just kind of spectacular. Now, you remember the Turnberry Agreement. This is supposed to be the grand deal. The European Union essentially kind of bent the knee, and they said that there was going to be a cap at 15% on tariffs, excluding a couple items that were coming out of the EU. They agreed to buy our energy, which they didn't really have a choice because America done blown up the big pipeline running through the ocean up there. And like I said, in exchange, we were going to cap the tariffs at 15%. But the second the new universal 15% tariff popped up, Europe slammed the brakes on the deal. Bernd Lang, the trade chief, basically comes out and calls the U.S. a rogue actor. And like I said, they demand that America honors their pledge. The Europeans are saying that the United States, this administration, need to honor their pledge, which I find to be an obscene demand to make of an administration that's done everything that it possibly can to act as dishonorably as possible. It was last month. Donald Trump got in front of the world and said that our European allies, our NATO allies, did nothing in Afghanistan. They've done everything that they could to belittle the acts and sacrifices of our allies, our brothers in arms. But again, you're asking this administration, who views international laws as suggestions, to capitulate something that they see is going to hurt their ego. You cannot negotiate with a partner who changes the rules of a casino when the ball is already spinning in the roulette wheel. So the EU is looking at America and saying, hey, there's no deal here, right? There's no deal here because there's no one at the wheel. There's no one actually steering this ship. Now, if we move over to the Indo-Pacific, this is where things really get dark. For the last decade, Washington, D.C. has been screaming how we need India and we need South Korea. South Korea is becoming a major player as far as defense industries go, and India is becoming the factory of the world. This was our way to counter the productivity of China. Now, these countries are making deals actively with the United States, South Korea, especially Japan. But they're looking at the situation like, well, if we do a deal, the Supreme Court could rule it illegal by next Tuesday. And all these commitments of making hundreds of billions of dollars into the United States, either through manufacturing, either through buying our goods, literally could mean completely nothing by next week. So why in God's name would South Korea open their domestic market or commit billions of dollars in shipbuilding when the US signature isn't even worth the paper that it's printed on? The thing is, when it comes to these trade deals, there has to be stability in order for long-term deals to even be contemplated. America is the furthest thing from being stable at this point. The United States right now is built on a fault line, not even built on sand. And it's a fault line of executive ego and judicial ping pong. Our contracts are essentially being written with a dry erase marker. I'm sitting here explaining this to Logan, and he understands the math. And then just to add a little bit of maple syrup to the destruction here in America, you've got the Premier of British Columbia, David Eby, talking about how he's thinking about dragging the United States to an international tribunal over the lumber market. Say hi, buddy. It's been a while. Look, 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 look. Hey. We slapped a tariff on Canadian softwood lumber. Now, if you're a politician and you go on the news on Sunday morning, you call this an American first victory. You're saying this is protecting domestic industry. But if you actually live in reality, if you're actually a person living in the United States, knowing that America is going through a housing crisis where there's a shortage of housing, and now your government has made 2x4s 15% more expensive, it just increases the catastrophic shortage of housing that we actually have. Because the only houses that are actually being built at this point are for the luxury market, because the normal average American simply cannot get approved for a mortgage. So our government is essentially killing their industry and spiking our own inflation and calling that a W. So this brings us to the real victims of this circus. It's not the politicians, and it's not the corporate executives at John Deere, the automotive markets. I mean, who they're looking at their earnings calls and are absolutely laughing while telling their investors, don't worry about the tariffs because we're just going to pass that to the consumer. The bag holder in this entire collapse is the American working class. And the tariffs are not paid by a foreign country. They're a regressive domestic consumption tax. You're trying to build a life. You're trying to raise a family. You're trying to go to the grocery market and buy diapers for a 9-month-old. This is my story. Or you're trying to replace a broken washing machine. And suddenly you're paying a 15% premium because some a-hole in Washington, D.C. decides that they want to have a headline for a Tuesday press brief. This isn't trade policy. It's chaos. It's a systemic failure disguised as economic nationalism. And this is exactly why people in America right now are looking for exits. That's exactly why people are Googling, how can I move to Canada? How can I move to England? How can I move to Greece? How can I move to Italy? Whatever, Portugal, Spain. When the empire can't even guarantee the rule of law in its own trade agreements, you start looking for places that can, not just the American people, but our trade partners as well. The world is ghosting America, and the people are trapped inside footing the bill for the privilege. This kind of instability affects our allies, yes. And the rest of the world looks at us and sees the clown show and laughs at America, yes. They deride America, yes. But I can't state enough how much of an impact this actually has on the American people, even if we don't realize it because we're not in touch with what's happening in the world. This is one of the worst qualities of the American people, is that we're insanely out of touch with our impacts on foreign nations and how our government actually conducts themselves geopolitically. Now, the consequences of these things are starting to come home, and it's going to have a great and grievous impact on the future of Americans. We still have 3 years of this. If nothing happens during the midterms, we still have 3 years of this. And we're looking at the corporate Democrats right now who are essentially doing nothing. We're having people like Bernie Sanders out there doing yeoman's work, really one of the only people who's actually representing the voice of the American people. And you can deride that as being, well, that's democratic socialism. But an equal and opposite reaction to the extreme capitalism that America has seen, I think, is necessary at this point. We are, our family, on the verge of going back to Europe, sadly only for a few months before we come back. And it's bittersweet. It's bittersweet to go to a country and only be there temporarily, knowing that living there is far superior in so many ways than it is here in America. And also that the potential for Americans to actually live a fruitful and fulfilling life is there, not just in another country, but here, if we were to make it happen. But like I said, Americans are so out of touch with what actually happens, not just internationally, but domestically. And one of the arguments for that is, well, people just don't have time. They are always at work. They're so busy. We have a hustle culture. You got to work 1 job and 2 jobs. You have to work 60 hours a week. You work an 8 to 5, 8 to 6 work schedule, and it's maddening. And it keeps people from living their life. And worst of all, this is done on purpose, because if you don't have the time to actually dig in and see what's happening in your own nation, you can't prevent the worst things from actually happening. And the people need to come to a decision of what an America looks like when the thin veneer of freedom, liberty, and justice that we once believed in has been scraped away by a corrupt and avaricious political class and elite class that just harvest everything from the people while leaving them with nothing. America doesn't have to be like that. Truly, it doesn't have to be. I know this and you know that because we are in control of our own households, and we can make it look like, and we can make it work how we want it to, how we want it to be. And it's the same thing as our country. I always believed, as I said, looking back to some of the foundational thinking of America, big fan of Common Sense by Thomas Paine, big fan. And one of the problems with America is just simply too many people. Too many people with too many narratives, too many cultures, really to be represented as a whole. And as we get more and more entrenched in our political narratives and our political thinking, the ways that we believe that the world should be raised that are antithetical to those next to us, I honestly do believe that the dissolution of the United States at some point is guaranteed, at least at this point. But with that kind of chaos happening internally, just some guy in the basement's mind, imagine the consternation, the confusion, and the aggravation that our trade allies go through while looking at our country, knowing that there's a large consumer base, knowing that there's people who want to spend money on their products, but they just can't do business with them right now. It's a bad place for us to be as Americans. And at some point, this will be over. It will be. And I think that that's one of the things that we all need to remember, right? This administration will go away at some point. And I don't think that we're going to fall into some terminal dictatorship that goes from generation to generation, because the American people, as stubborn and as slow to act as they are, eventually enough will be enough. This is something I honestly believe. But yeah, as far as trade goes after these tariffs, this is going to have a big impact on the American people. You're going to see price hikes like we've seen before. Those are going to continue. The devaluation of the dollar is going to continue. And stagflation, of course, taking hold of the American working class, making things harder and harder. So either pick up the pitchforks and torches, or hey, pick up your passport and thinking about getting out, because these are really the only options that the American people have at this point. But thanks for stopping by as always. Like and subscribe, hype the video. We appreciate you guys as always. Any questions, put it down in the comment section. Anything you want to talk about, put in the comment section. But there's a lot of comments these days, so super chat, super thanks with your question. Definitely always helps. But food for thought, everyone. Take care.